Mafia boss entered the room quietly and saw the black maid praying for his son. He couldn't speak. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get to today's story. It was late afternoon, and the large mansion was eerily quiet, bathed in the soft, golden glow of the setting sun that filtered through the grand windows. The kind of mansion that spoke of untold wealth. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and rooms that stretched endlessly, giving the house a feeling of infinite space. But behind the grandeur, there was a moment of vulnerability, a moment of quietness that contrasted sharply with the wealth and power that filled the walls of the house. Inside the master bedroom, a scene was unfolding that few would believe if they had not seen it with their own eyes. There, in the middle of the room, knelt a woman, her dark hands pressed together in a prayer, her head bowed in quiet devotion. She wasn't praying for herself, but for the child of the man who owned this mansion, the powerful mafia boss who ruled not just the city, but entire networks of influence. The child, a young boy, lay on the bed, his face contorted in discomfort. His small body was racked with fever, and his breathing was shallow. The maid, a woman of humble background, had no obligation to be there, no reason to care. Yet, she did. She knelt beside the boy, whispering words of comfort, praying for his recovery. To anyone else, it may have seemed like a simple act of compassion. But to the mafia boss, it was something entirely unexpected. He had known the maid for months, but never had he seen her like this, praying for his son, offering something that felt far beyond the duties of her station. The door creaked open quietly, and there, standing at the threshold, was the man who controlled everything in this mansion, the one whose presence could freeze any conversation, halt any action. He was silent as he watched her, this woman who, in his eyes, was nothing more than a servant, acting with a kindness that had caught him completely off guard. His dark eyes scanned the room, taking in the sight of the maid, her form illuminated by the soft light, her voice barely audible as she prayed. He had seen many things in his life, many actions driven by power, greed, and ambition. But this was different. He stepped into the room slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing softly in the silence. But the maid did not notice him at first. She was completely focused on the child, her hands still pressed in prayer. He stood there for a moment, just watching, unsure of what to do. There was a tightness in his chest, a strange feeling he couldn't identify. He was the man who controlled everything, the man who made decisions that shaped lives with a single word. But in this moment, he was powerless. His son's health, the thing he cared about more than anything, was in the hands of a woman who had no reason to care for him. But she did, and that struck him harder than anything else ever had. The maid lifted her head and saw him standing there, his gaze fixed on her. She froze for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure if she had done something wrong. But there was no anger in his eyes, no harsh command, only a look of disbelief. She knew her place, and it was not to speak unless spoken to. But in that moment, she saw something in his eyes that stopped her heart, something she never expected to see from a man like him. Vulnerability. His voice broke the silence, soft but heavy with unspoken words. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone almost too quiet to hear. But the maid, still kneeling, simply replied, "I am praying for him. Your son. He is suffering. I want him to get better." His gaze softened, and for the first time in months, the mafia boss couldn't speak. What could he say? What could he possibly say to someone who was showing him more humanity than he had ever expected? The power he wielded, the life he controlled, none of that mattered now. He was faced with a woman who had shown him something he had long forgotten: kindness. It was a moment that would change both of their lives forever. I hope you are ready for the next part of our story. As the mafia boss stood there, his heart still racing from the moment of vulnerability he had just witnessed, his eyes never left the black maid who was still kneeling beside his son, her hands trembling slightly as she continued her quiet prayer. The room seemed to hold its breath as the powerful man, who had once seemed impervious to everything, now felt a wave of emotions he wasn't accustomed to. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure of himself. In his world, everything was about control. Control over people, over situations, over outcomes. But in this small, silent moment, he had no control. His son, his most precious possession, was lying there, weak and sick, and it was the maid, a simple, humble woman, who was offering the care and compassion his son needed. He had never expected to see something so pure in a world full of greed, power, and corruption. The child's slow, steady breathing was the only sound in the room, a sound that seemed to ease the tension in the air. The Mafia boss stepped forward slowly, not entirely sure what he was doing, but his instincts told him to do something, anything. As he approached, the maid glanced up at him, her face a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She had never imagined that the man she worked for, a figure so formidable and cold, would ever show any kind of emotion, let alone vulnerability. But here he was, standing before her, looking at her with a kind of rawness that made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, there was only silence between them, and in that silence, something shifted. The Mafia boss could feel the weight of the years of his hardened heart, the years of indifference and ruthlessness, slowly beginning to lift. He didn't know what it was, but there was something about this woman, this maid, who had shown him more humanity than anyone he had ever known. His voice, when it came, was quieter than she had expected, almost hesitant. "You care for him, don't you?" he asked, his words heavy with an emotion he couldn't name. The maid, still kneeling beside his son, nodded slowly. "I do, sir. I care for him like he was my own. No child should suffer like this." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight of truth that struck him harder than any act of violence ever could. He had seen countless people killed, lives destroyed with a single word, but this was different. This was kindness, pure and simple, something he had not experienced in years. He found himself struggling to speak, as if the words caught in his throat. For so long, he had built walls around his heart, walls that were unbreakable, walls that protected him from the world's messiness and pain. But now, in this room, in front of this woman, those walls seemed to be crumbling. His eyes flicked to his son, still lying motionless on the bed, and for the first time, he felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: helplessness. The maid, seeing his struggle, gently placed her hand on the boy's forehead, her touch light and comforting. "He's a strong boy," she said softly. "He'll make it through. He just needs love, care, and time." The Mafia boss stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He was a man of action, a man who had always been in control, but in this moment, he realized that control meant nothing. It was love, kindness, and care that mattered most. His son needed that more than anything else. And this woman, this maid, had shown him that. Slowly, he took a step back and gestured for her to continue. "Please," he said, his voice still a bit hoarse, "do what you need to do." The maid nodded without a word and returned to her quiet prayer, her hands steady now, her voice soft and soothing. The Mafia boss stood in the doorway, watching her, as the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that could happen, settled over him. He had always thought that power was the most important thing in the world. But now, as he watched this humble woman care for his son with a tenderness he had never known, he realized that maybe, just maybe, it was something else that truly mattered. It was the kindness of one person, acting out of love, that could change the course of everything. The Mafia boss wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. And that hope, like the prayer that filled the room, was something he never expected to find in a place like this. I hope you're ready for the next part of this story. The quiet room was filled with the sound of soft prayer, a steady rhythm of hope that echoed in the silence. The Mafia boss stood at the doorway, watching as the black maid continued her tender care for his son. The boy was still, his body weak, but there was a calmness in the air now that hadn't been there before. He had been watching for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak, lost in the complexity of his emotions. A man used to controlling everything around him. He found himself feeling utterly powerless. The maid's presence, her kindness, had disarmed him in ways he never thought possible. The Mafia boss's usual demeanor, cold, calculating, and ruthless, seemed distant in this moment. He couldn't bring himself to leave. The sight of his son lying there, vulnerable and sick, was a reminder of just how fragile life could be. And there, kneeling beside him, was a woman who, despite the power dynamics between them, had shown more humanity than anyone else in his life ever had. She was a maid, nothing more than a servant to him. But the way she cared for his son, the way she prayed for him, made the Mafia boss question everything he had known. He stood there for a long while, unsure of what to do. His mind raced. Should he leave? Should he stay and continue to watch? But something stopped him. It was the way she treated his son, with such tenderness and care, as though she saw him as more than just the child of a Mafia boss. She saw him as a human being, someone worthy of compassion, not just a tool or pawn in the dangerous game that was their world. He had spent years building a life based on power and fear, but in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the fragile life in front of him, and the woman who had shown him the kind of kindness he had long since forgotten. The boy's small hand twitched, breaking the stillness of the room, and the maid gently placed her palm on his forehead, murmuring soothing words under her breath. The Mafia boss felt a shift inside him. He had been hardened by years of violence, deceit, and betrayal. But now, standing in the doorway, watching this woman offer the one thing he had denied himself for so long, genuine care, he felt something stir inside him. His heart, which had been buried under layers of power, anger, and control, was starting to thaw. Without thinking, he took a step forward, crossing the room slowly, unsure of what to say. When he was close enough, the maid looked up, her face still soft with the concern for his son. She hesitated for a moment, surprised by his proximity. He had never been this close to her before, not without the distance of authority and power separating them. But now, in this room, he wasn't the Mafia boss. He was just a father, worried for his child. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough. She blinked in surprise, unsure if she had heard him correctly. I'm just doing what I can," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. "It's more than that," he said, his gaze flickering to his son. "You're doing more than just taking care of him. You're showing him what kindness truly is." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The Mafia boss had always believed that power was the key to everything, that strength and fear were the tools to control the world around him. But now, watching this woman, his servant, care for his son in a way he never could, he realized just how empty that belief had been. Power had never been the answer. The answer had always been something simpler, something more human. He looked down at the maid again, his heart beating a little faster. "I've never seen anyone care like you do," he said, the words sounding foreign even to him. "Not in my world. Not in my life." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Sometimes, it's the smallest acts of kindness that have the most power," she replied. Her words struck him hard. He had spent his entire life in a world that valued strength and dominance, where the vulnerable were discarded and kindness was seen as weakness. But now, standing before her, he realized that what he had believed in all these years was nothing but a lie. The real power was in the kindness she had shown, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a shift inside him. It was as if the weight of his past, the weight of his decisions, was lifting, if only for a moment. His son stirred again, this time with a softer breath, and the maid's hand never left his forehead. She smiled down at him, a gentle smile that spoke of years of care, of love given freely. The Mafia boss took a step back, his mind still racing. He didn't know what this meant for him or his world, but he knew that this moment, this small act of kindness, had changed him. And it had changed his view of the woman who, despite her place in the world, had shown him that there was still goodness, still humanity, even in the darkest corners of life. He didn't know what the future would hold, but he did know one thing. For the first time in years, he felt something worth protecting, something more valuable than any empire or any amount of money. And that something was his son, and the woman who had reminded him of the power of kindness. I hope you're ready for the next part of this journey. The Mafia boss stood by the door for what felt like hours, still processing everything that had unfolded in front of him. His son was sleeping peacefully now, the fever having subsided, and the black maid was still kneeling by his side. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief, but also confusion. This woman, his maid, had somehow brought a calmness to the chaos of his life. She had done what no one else had been able to do, not with money, not with power, but with simple kindness. He had always believed that strength, control, and fear were the keys to his success, but now, watching her tend to his son, he saw something different. Something he had never really acknowledged before. As he watched her, he noticed the small details. The way her hands gently adjusted the blanket around his son, the soft murmurs of comfort, the pure sincerity in her eyes. She wasn't just a servant. She was something more. Someone who had more heart, more courage than he had ever given her credit for. Slowly, he walked over to the bed, his footsteps quiet against the soft carpet. The maid glanced up, startled for a moment by his presence. But when she saw the look in his eyes, she relaxed. She had expected nothing from him, and yet, here he was. The man who had been a figure of power and fear to everyone around him was now standing beside her, looking at her in a way that felt different, vulnerable, even. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of everything hanging between them. Then, in a voice softer than she had ever heard from him, he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his words surprising even himself. "For what?" she asked, her voice gentle, unsure of what he was referring to. "For being here. For doing this. For caring about him." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of meaning. The maid looked down at his son, who was now sleeping peacefully. She wasn't sure what to say. She had never expected anything in return for her actions. She had only done what felt right. But his words hit her harder than she had anticipated. "It's nothing," she said quietly, shaking her head. "I just wanted to help." The Mafia boss studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes tracing every line of her face. He had never seen her like this before, without fear, without hesitation. He had always viewed her as just another servant, another face in the background. But now, as he stood before her, he saw something he had missed all along. He saw strength in her. He saw a woman who was more than just the title that society had placed on her. His heart softened, just slightly, as he realized that she was the one who had truly shown him something he had never thought possible: kindness. Something that, for all his wealth and power, he had never experienced in his world. The Mafia boss, who had never been afraid of anything in his life, now felt a strange sense of vulnerability. He didn't know what to say next. He didn't know how to express the gratitude he felt. But before he could say another word, the maid stood up, her movements graceful and quiet. She glanced at him and then back at the boy on the bed, and for a moment, she seemed to gather her thoughts. "He's a strong boy," she said softly. "He'll be okay." The Mafia boss nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I know," he said, his voice low. "I know he will." There was something in her eyes, something that made him believe her. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, to manipulate everything around him. But here, with her, he realized how powerless he had been all along. It wasn't his power, his empire, or his wealth that mattered. It was the ability to care for others, to show kindness, to protect those you loved. It was a realization that hit him like a thunderbolt, leaving him speechless. The maid smiled at him, a soft, quiet smile, and then turned back to the boy, her attention once again focused on him. The Mafia boss stood there for a few more moments, still unsure of what to do with this new understanding. He had never felt so vulnerable in his life, but it wasn't a feeling he disliked. For the first time, he felt a shift within himself, a change he couldn't explain. And as he looked at the maid, he knew that this moment, this simple act of kindness, had changed everything. For the first time in years, he felt something more than just power. He felt human. He looked down at his son again, then back at the maid, and without thinking, he spoke. "You're not just a maid," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She turned to him, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You're not just a servant," he said again. "You've done more for him than anyone else ever has. You've done more for me than anyone else ever could." The maid blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had never expected such words from him, especially not from a man like him. But the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. For the first time, she saw him in a different light, a man who was capable of seeing beyond the surface, beyond the walls he had built around himself. And for the first time, she felt seen. The Mafia boss turned and started to walk out of the room, but before he reached the door, He paused and looked back at her. I'll make sure you and your family are taken care of, he said, his voice steady. Whatever you need. She stared at him for a moment, unsure of what to say. She had never expected anything in return for her actions, but now, she understood something deeper. The kindness she had shown had reached beyond what she could have imagined. It had made a difference, and for the first time, she felt that she had done something truly worthwhile. I hope you are ready for the next part of the story. The following morning, a strange quiet still hung over the mansion. It was not the usual silence, the type that came with the weight of power and fear. This was different. It was softer, almost peaceful. The sun filtered through the grand windows, casting warm light across the room where the Mafia boss had stood the night before, watching as his son slept peacefully. He had always lived in a world where nothing seemed to touch him, where power and control were his tools. But this was different. His son was better now, thanks to the black maid who had cared for him, prayed for him, and shown him kindness when no one else could. The Mafia boss stood at the window, staring out at the sprawling grounds below. He had never known such a feeling, vulnerability, perhaps, but also something else, something deeper. He didn't know how to handle it. But one thing was clear. He could no longer ignore the change that had taken place in him. He had always believed that strength was about dominance, about making others fear you. But the woman who had cared for his son had shown him a different kind of strength, one based on kindness, sacrifice, and humanity. He had watched her quietly, taking everything in, from the way she prayed to the way she comforted his son. She had done what no one else could. She had healed his son, not just with medicine, but with compassion. His mind wandered back to the moment when he had told her she wasn't just a maid. He had meant it. She had proven that she was more than the label society had placed on her. She had shown him what true strength was, and in doing so, had made him question everything he thought he knew. He had never considered how others saw him. The Mafia boss was a figure feared by many, a man who could make decisions with a snap of his fingers that would change lives forever. But now, with the sight of the maid's soft smile still fresh in his mind, he realized that fear wasn't the answer to everything. He had never thought much about the people who worked for him, his employees, his maids, his security detail. They were simply part of the machine that made his world run. But now, he found himself thinking about them differently, thinking about her differently. He couldn't shake the thought of her. The maid who had risked so much to care for his son, the woman who had stood in a world that never saw her as anything more than a servant, and yet had shown more heart than anyone else he knew. He was ashamed of how he had treated people like her, ashamed of how he had built his life on power alone, without ever once considering the humanity behind the people who helped him achieve his empire. He knew he needed to do something. He couldn't let this go. The next day, he called for the maid. She arrived in the same simple uniform she always wore, her eyes downcast as she entered the room. But today, she could sense something was different. The atmosphere had changed in the house, in the way the boss looked at her, and she didn't know what it meant. She was nervous, but she didn't show it. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded toward the chair in front of his desk. "Please sit down," he said softly. She hesitated before walking over and taking a seat, her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It felt like the first time they were truly seeing each other as equals, even if neither of them said it aloud. "I've been thinking," the Mafia boss began, his voice low. "About everything. About you." The maid looked up, surprised. She didn't know what to say. He had never spoken to her like this before. "You've done something for my son that no one else could. You've given him something I never could. You've given him kindness. And I've spent my entire life building an empire on fear, but I think I've been wrong." The maid's heart skipped a beat. Was he really saying this? Was he admitting what she thought he was? The Mafia boss looked at her, his dark eyes softer than they had ever been. "I've been wrong," he repeated, "and I need to make things right. For you. For my son. For everyone." She didn't know what to say. She had never imagined a man like him would ever say something like that. It was a moment of vulnerability she never expected from someone so powerful. "I want to offer you more than just a job," he continued. "I want to offer you respect. I want to offer you a place in this house where you're not just a maid, where you are valued, where you are seen." Her breath caught in her throat. This was everything she had never expected. She had always believed that people like her would never be more than what society saw them as: servants, invisible, not worth noticing. But now, the man who had once treated her as nothing more than a part of his household machinery was offering her something far greater. He was offering her dignity, offering her respect. It was a moment that made her heart swell, a moment that changed everything for her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his voice warm. "Just know that things are different now. And so are you. You've shown me what I've been missing." The maid looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had never expected this, but here it was. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet understand. And for the first time, she felt truly seen. I hope you're ready for the next chapter. The following morning, as sunlight poured through the grand windows, the Mafia boss found himself standing in the same room where everything had shifted. The maid was no longer just a servant to him. She had become someone far more significant, someone who had changed not only his perception of the world but of himself. He had always considered himself to be a man of power, a man who ruled with an iron fist. But what had occurred in the past few days had torn down the walls he had built around his heart. The morning passed quietly, the house operating as usual, but there was a noticeable difference in the air, a sense of respect that hadn't existed before. He had not only offered the maid a place of dignity within his household, but had also begun to treat her as someone who mattered, as someone equal. For the first time in years, the Mafia boss found himself looking at the people around him differently. They were not just pieces in his game. They were people, each with their own value, each deserving of respect. This realization came with its own challenges, however. In the world he inhabited, the world of organized crime and power, vulnerability was a weakness, and showing too much compassion could be dangerous. Yet, he felt no hesitation now. The maid had proven to him that kindness was not a weakness. In fact, it had given him strength in ways he hadn't imagined. As the day progressed, he sought out the maid. She was in the kitchen, preparing lunch for his son, who was now recovering steadily. Her focus was entirely on the boy, and for a moment, the Mafia boss watched her silently. She moved with such grace, with such purpose, that it struck him again how different she was from anyone he had ever known. He had never expected someone like her to have such an impact on his life. Slowly, he approached her, his footsteps quiet against the polished floors. She noticed him immediately, glancing up with a slight start. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. He smiled at her, a small, genuine smile that was rare for him. "Everything is fine," he replied, his voice calm. "But I wanted to talk to you. To thank you." The maid hesitated, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Thank me? For what?" she asked, her tone uncertain. "For everything," he said softly. "For caring for my son. For caring about him when no one else could. For showing me something I never saw before." He paused, looking into her eyes. "For showing me that strength isn't about control. It's about compassion. It's about making a choice to do what's right, even when it's hard." She stood still, processing his words. It was clear she hadn't expected this kind of conversation. She had never asked for recognition or reward for her actions. She had only done what felt right in the moment. But hearing him speak so openly about it made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Valued. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." He nodded, understanding that. "I know," he said, his voice low. "But I also know that not many people would do what you did. Not many people would show the kindness you've shown. You've given my son something I couldn't, and for that, I will always be grateful." His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, they were both silent. The weight of the moment was palpable, but there was something else too, an understanding that had formed between them, something that transcended the roles they had played in each other's lives. "I'm not used to this," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Being grateful, being vulnerable." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to be afraid of it." The Mafia boss smiled again, a little more genuinely this time. "I'm not afraid," he said. "I'm just learning that there's more to life than power, more to being a man than control. I've spent so many years building my empire, and I never stopped to think about the people I've hurt, the people I've disregarded." The maid's expression softened, her eyes full of empathy. "We all make mistakes," she said. "But what matters is what we do next." His gaze lingered on her for a moment, and he realized that she was right. What mattered was what he did next. What would you say, he began, his voice quiet but steady, if I offered you a new role in this house? Not as a maid, but as someone with a say. Someone who matters in ways beyond what anyone could have expected. She looked at him, surprised by the offer. A new role? She repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, he said, nodding slowly. I want you to have the respect you deserve. And I want you to be more than just a servant to my family. You've proven that you're capable of much more than that. The maid was speechless for a moment, processing the weight of what he was offering. I don't know what to say, she finally replied. You don't have to say anything, he said. I just want you to know that I see you. And I appreciate you. More than you'll ever know. She smiled, a soft, quiet smile that reflected the peace she had been feeling ever since she had come into this house. Thank you, she whispered, the sincerity in her voice making the moment even more meaningful. For the first time, she felt like she truly belonged, not just in this house, but in the world. And for the Mafia boss, the journey of change was just beginning. I hope you are ready for the next chapter of this story. The days that followed were unlike any the Mafia boss had ever known. The changes in his household were subtle but significant. The house felt different, more alive, as though the weight of the old power dynamics had shifted. The maid, now recognized as more than just a servant, moved with a quiet confidence, her presence no longer confined to the background. She became part of the fabric of the house, a quiet force of compassion that had a lasting impact on everyone around her. The Mafia boss, who had always ruled with fear and intimidation, found himself changing in ways he couldn't fully understand. He spent more time with his son, watching him recover, not just physically but emotionally. The bond between them was growing, and he could feel it. The presence of the maid in their lives had created a bond that was stronger than anything he had ever known. His son now smiled more, laughed more, and even began to open up to him in ways that had seemed impossible before. The boss could feel himself becoming more present, less detached, and he knew it had something to do with the maid. One evening, after dinner, the Mafia boss found himself sitting in his study, staring out at the city lights, contemplating everything that had happened. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of the changes he had witnessed. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a feeling he hadn't realized he had longed for. It wasn't the kind of peace he had always imagined, peace through control and power. No, this was different. This was peace through understanding, through connection. And it was all because of the black maid who had shown him that there was more to life than dominance. He had seen her care for his son, her gentleness, her patience, and her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. It was something he had never truly understood before. The concept of kindness, of putting someone else's needs before your own, was foreign to him. But now, after everything he had witnessed, he couldn't deny it. The next morning, the boss called the maid into his office. He had been thinking about this moment for a while, and now it was time to act. He wanted to express his gratitude, but more than that, he wanted to make sure she knew how much she had changed his life. As she entered, he looked up at her, his eyes softening slightly. She still wore the same uniform, but there was a sense of dignity in her posture that hadn't been there before. She had earned that dignity. "You've done something for me that I can never repay," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "I don't think I fully realized it at the time, but the way you cared for my son, the way you showed him kindness, it's more than anything I could ever have imagined." The maid stood quietly, not sure how to respond. She had never expected anything from him, never expected words of thanks. She had only done what she felt was right. But hearing him speak this way, acknowledging her efforts, meant more than she could say. "It was nothing," she said, her voice gentle. "I just wanted to help." The Mafia boss shook his head. "No, it wasn't nothing. It was everything," he replied, his tone firm. "And because of you, my son is healing, and I'm beginning to understand things I never thought possible. I've spent my life trying to control everything around me. But you've shown me something better, something more important." He paused, taking a deep breath as if gathering the courage to say what he truly felt. "I want you to know that you're not just an employee in this house. You're not just a maid. You are someone I respect. You've earned that respect." Her heart swelled with emotion. She had never expected this. She had always known her place in the world, had always accepted that she would never be more than a servant. But now, here he was, offering her something she had never dared to dream of: respect. The Mafia boss continued, his gaze softening even more. I want to offer you something more. A place in this family, a role that goes beyond the walls of this house. You've shown me a kind of strength I never knew existed. And for that, I want to make sure you are taken care of, that you are valued. The maid's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. The man who had once seen her as nothing more than an employee, someone to be dismissed without a second thought, was now offering her a chance to be something more. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. You don't have to say anything, he replied gently. Just know that you matter, that you've changed my life, and you've changed my son's life. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. It wasn't out of sadness, it was out of something else. Something she had never felt before. She had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. And in that moment, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The Mafia boss stood, walking toward her slowly. I won't forget what you've done, he said, his voice steady. And I'll make sure you are never overlooked again. She nodded, still overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. He turned and walked to the door, pausing before leaving. One more thing, he said, turning back to her. You're part of this family now, and I will protect you, as I would anyone in my care. The words, simple as they were, carried more weight than any he had ever spoken. And for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss knew that he wasn't just talking about power. He was talking about something far more important: loyalty, kindness, and the bond between a family. I hope you're ready for the next part of the story. The days that followed were quiet, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. The Mafia boss, a man who had once prided himself on his control, now found himself feeling something he had never truly allowed himself to experience: connection. His relationship with his son had deepened, and for the first time, they truly began to bond. It wasn't just the result of the boy's recovery, but the love and kindness that had been brought into their lives by the maid. She had done more than care for his son. She had opened his eyes to the importance of showing compassion, of being present for the ones you love. The Mafia boss had never understood the importance of vulnerability until now. His entire life had been built on power and fear, but those things no longer seemed to matter in the same way. He was starting to realize that true strength wasn't about control. It was about being willing to give and receive love. He had offered the maid respect, but now he felt it in a way he never had before. She had changed him in ways that he couldn't yet fully articulate, but he knew he was a different man because of her. It was a quiet evening when the change truly hit him. The Mafia boss stood by the window, looking out over the city. His empire, his wealth, it all seemed distant now. The boy was asleep upstairs, and the maid was tending to the house. He had wanted to offer her something more, to show her that she mattered, but what he realized now was that he had been the one who needed to change. He was still the boss, the head of his organization, but in this house, he was simply a father, trying to be better for his son. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was the maid. She had a soft smile on her face, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. Sir, she began, her voice respectful but unsure. I wanted to speak with you. The Mafia boss motioned for her to come in. Of course, he said, his voice warm. Is something wrong? She shook her head. No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to thank you for everything. The words took him by surprise. He had offered her respect, but hearing her thank him made him realize just how far their relationship had come. She was no longer just someone in his service. She had become a person who mattered, who was part of his life in a way he had never imagined. You don't need to thank me, he replied, his tone gentle. You've done more for us than I could ever express. The maid looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. You've given me something I never thought I would have, she said quietly. A place where I feel valued. He nodded, understanding what she meant. He had given her respect, but she had given him something far more valuable. The realization that kindness, love, and connection were the true sources of strength. You've changed me, he said, his voice steady. I didn't understand what it meant to truly care for someone, but you've shown me what it means. Not just for my son, but for everyone around me. The maid's eyes softened. I just did what felt right, she said. I didn't expect anything in return. And you didn't need to, he replied. But I want you to know that your kindness has made all the difference. You've given me more than I could have ever given myself. The maid looked down for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her. "I never expected anything from you," she said softly. "But I've always wanted to make a difference, to do something that mattered." He stepped closer, his expression serious. "You've done more than you'll ever know," he said. "You've made me a better man, a better father, a better leader." The maid smiled, the weight of his words settling in her heart. She had always felt like an outsider, always thought that she would never be seen for who she truly was. But now, in this moment, she felt that she had found a place where she was valued. The Mafia boss was no longer just the intimidating figure who ruled the streets. He was a father who cared for his son, a man who had learned the power of kindness and vulnerability. And in that quiet moment, the two of them shared something that transcended their roles, something far more important than the positions they held in the world. It was a bond of trust, of mutual respect, and of love. The boss's transformation was not complete, but he had made the first step toward becoming a man who understood that true strength came not from power, but from the ability to care for others. The maid had shown him that, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the need to control everything around him. He felt a sense of peace that he had never known. For the first time, he felt whole. And in that moment, as the two of them stood there, silently understanding the depth of what had been shared, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. His life had changed. His family had changed. And it was all because of the kindness of one woman, who had shown him the true power of love. I hope you're ready for the next part of the story. Days passed, and a sense of calm began to settle in the mansion, but with it came something more profound: change. The Mafia boss, once a figure of iron control, was transforming, though he didn't yet fully understand how deep that transformation ran. His son was thriving, smiling more, laughing more, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt that perhaps he had found a new way to live. He had learned from the maid, whose quiet strength and compassion had opened his eyes to something greater than the pursuit of power. The Mafia boss had always relied on his empire, the wealth, the influence, the fear he inspired. But now, he realized that real power came from the ability to give, to be vulnerable, and to care for others. His heart had softened, not just toward his son, but toward everyone around him. Even his most trusted associates noticed the change in him. They could see the subtle shift in his behavior. He was more present, more thoughtful, more deliberate in his actions. The hard edges he had carried for years were beginning to soften, and it was starting to show in how he ran his empire. But with this newfound humanity came questions. Was he still the same man who had risen to power through ruthless ambition? Was he still the Mafia boss, feared by all who crossed his path? Or was he something else now? And what about the maid? The woman who had changed his life in ways he never expected. She had seen him for who he truly was, someone capable of both great strength and deep vulnerability, and she had not turned away. For that, he respected her more than anyone else. It had been a week since the conversation they had shared, and he could not get her out of his mind. He had been so consumed by his own world, his own power, for so long that he had never taken the time to truly see the people who worked for him. The maid had changed that for him, and he wanted to show her that he recognized her value, that she mattered in a way that went beyond her role in his household. He had made up his mind. He was going to do something that would not only change her life, but would also solidify his own transformation. He would offer her a place at his side, as an equal, someone who was not bound by the roles of servant and master. He wanted her to have the chance to show the world who she truly was. It was late in the evening when he finally found the courage to speak to her again. He had been avoiding this moment, uncertain of how she would respond, but he knew he could no longer put it off. She was in the living room, sitting by the fireplace, reading. The light from the flames danced across her face, softening her features in a way that made her look even more serene than usual. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. She hadn't noticed him yet, and he allowed himself to observe her quietly, taking in the peacefulness she had brought into his life. She had no idea what her presence had done for him, how she had made him a better person. Finally, he stepped into the room. She looked up, startled for a moment, but then relaxed when she saw who it was. "Sir," she greeted him with a respectful nod. He motioned for her to put the book down, his voice steady but with a hint of emotion. "Please, call me by my name," he said. "You've earned that much, at least." She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Of course. I've been thinking," he began, walking over to the chair opposite hers. About everything. About how I've lived my life, and about you. She looked at him, curious but wary. He wasn't used to being so open with anyone. His life had always been built on secrecy, on maintaining control, but this was different. I want to offer you something, he continued. A place at my side. Not as my maid, but as someone I can rely on, someone I respect. You've done something for me that no one else could. You've shown me what real strength is, and for that, I want to make sure you are treated with the respect you deserve. The maid looked at him, her eyes wide in surprise. She had never imagined that the Mafia boss would offer her anything more than what he already had. She had always known her place, always accepted her role without question, but now, here he was, offering her something she had never expected. A chance to be something more. I don't know what to say, she said, her voice trembling slightly. You don't have to say anything, he replied softly. I just want you to know that you've changed my life. You've shown me that there's more to this world than power, more to life than control. You've shown me the value of compassion, and I want to make sure you have the chance to live your life with the respect and dignity you deserve. She was silent for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time, she realized that what she had done for his son had made a difference, not just in his life, but in her own. She had never expected anything in return, but now she was being offered something far greater than she could have imagined. A chance to live her life on her own terms, as someone who mattered. I would be honored, she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. The Mafia boss nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. Then it's settled, he said. You'll have a new role here, one that reflects your true worth. I won't forget what you've done, and I'll make sure no one else does either. As he spoke those words, he realized that this wasn't just about the maid anymore. It was about his own redemption, his own path toward becoming a better man. And for the first time in his life, he felt at peace with the choices he had made. The change that had begun with the simple act of kindness had spread through his entire life, and he knew that it was only the beginning. I hope you're ready for the next chapter of this journey. As the days went on, life at the mansion began to settle into a new rhythm, one that felt strangely lighter, despite the weight of the past. The Mafia boss had kept his word, and things had shifted, subtly but undeniably. His son continued to recover, his laughter filling the halls more often than it ever had before. The bond between them was growing, and the boss found himself more present, more involved in his son's life. For the first time, he wasn't just the powerful figure everyone feared. He was a father, deeply invested in the well-being of his child. The maid, now no longer just a servant in his eyes, had become an integral part of their lives. She had shown him how to be vulnerable, how to care, and how to value the people who were often overlooked. It wasn't just about her role in the household anymore. It was about her place in their lives. He had given her the respect she deserved, and in return, she had given him something invaluable, a sense of purpose and connection that went beyond his empire. The Mafia boss, despite all the power and wealth at his disposal, was beginning to understand something he had long ignored. Real strength came not from control, but from the ability to love and care for others. He had never imagined that a simple maid, someone he had once dismissed as inconsequential, would be the one to teach him that lesson. One evening, as the sun began to set and the mansion was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the boss found himself reflecting on everything that had changed. His mind was still caught up in the implications of his decisions, offering the maid a new role in his life, offering her a future that was no longer bound by the chains of servitude. He had promised to make sure she was never overlooked again, and he intended to keep that promise. But there was still more to be done. The Mafia boss had always ruled through fear, through the power of his position, but now he found himself questioning that approach. He no longer wanted to be the man who inspired terror in others. He wanted to be the man who inspired respect, who commanded loyalty through kindness and honor, not fear. It was a difficult concept to wrap his mind around, but he had been changing, slowly but surely. He had come to realize that true loyalty couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned. And the maid had earned his loyalty, not through force or manipulation, but through her unwavering commitment to what was right. He knew he couldn't change everything overnight, but he was determined to try. He had to start somewhere, and that somewhere was with the people closest to him. As he stood by the large window, looking out over the sprawling grounds, he made a decision. It was time to make sure that those who had stood by him, those who had shown him loyalty, were treated with the same respect he had begun to show the maid. He would start with his inner circle, those who had served him faithfully but who had never been given the recognition they deserved. He would make sure they knew that he saw them, that their loyalty was not something he took for granted. He had spent too many years taking people for granted, too many years thinking that power alone could keep people in line. It was time to do things differently. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was the maid, as always, entering the room with quiet grace. "Sir," she began, her voice respectful but with a hint of concern, "is everything all right?" The boss turned to face her, his expression softened by the weight of his thoughts. "Everything is fine," he said, his voice calm. "I've just been thinking." She looked at him, her eyes steady and kind, as if waiting for him to continue. "About everything that's happened," he said, walking over to where she stood. "About you, about my son, about how things have changed around here." He paused, his gaze focused on her. "I wanted to make sure you know that I haven't forgotten what you've done for us. What you've done for me. You've taught me something I didn't even realize I needed to learn." The maid looked at him, her expression soft but confused. "What do you mean, sir?" she asked gently. "I mean that you've shown me what true strength is," he replied. "It's not about power or control or fear. It's about doing what's right. It's about caring, about being there for the people who need you. You've shown me that, and I want to make sure you know how much I respect that." The maid's eyes widened in surprise. She had never expected such words from him. She had always known her place in the world, had always accepted that she would never be more than a servant. But now, here he was, offering her something she had never dreamed possible, respect. "You've given me more than I could ever ask for," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "You've given me a place in this house, a place where I am valued. And for that, I am truly grateful." The boss nodded, his eyes softening. "You deserve that and more. I'll make sure you are never overlooked again. I promise you that." For a moment, there was silence between them, a quiet understanding passing between them. The Mafia boss had changed, and in that change, he had come to understand something far more important than wealth or power. He had come to understand the value of human connection, of compassion, and of loyalty earned through kindness. He no longer feared vulnerability. He embraced it. And for the first time in his life, he knew that his empire, his family, was built not on the foundations of fear, but on the foundations of respect, love, and understanding. I hope you are ready for the next part of the story. The Mafia boss found himself deep in thought as he sat at his desk, overlooking the sprawling mansion grounds. It had been weeks since the conversation that had altered everything, the conversation with the maid. The changes he had been grappling with, though small at first, were now undeniable. The house felt different. The people around him seemed different. And, most importantly, he felt different. The shift in his life was profound. Where once there had been a rigid sense of control, there was now a subtle, almost imperceptible openness to vulnerability and trust. His son, who had once been so distant, was now reaching out to him in ways he never had before. They spent more time together, and the bond between them deepened every day. The boy was thriving, and so was the boss. And it was all because of one woman, the maid, whose compassion and strength had changed everything. He had been careful, at first, not to acknowledge how much she had affected him. He had promised to treat her with respect, to offer her something more than just a position in his household. But what he hadn't anticipated was how much she would change his view of himself. He had always considered his power and influence to be the center of his life, the reason for everything he had. But now, he was beginning to see that there was more to life than control. It was kindness, vulnerability, and connection that truly mattered. His relationship with the maid had brought that lesson to life in ways that were hard for him to articulate, but he felt it deeply. It wasn't just about her role in his household anymore. It was about what she had given him, the chance to be human again, to care for someone without the weight of fear hanging over him. She had shown him that kindness was not a weakness but a strength, and he was starting to embrace that truth more and more. But as much as he had changed, there was still something unsettled within him. He knew that change could be fleeting, that even the most profound shifts could be undone by the forces of habit, fear, and control that had shaped him for so long. He had to be sure, more than ever, that this transformation was real, that it wasn't just a temporary reaction to the challenges of the past weeks. He needed to test it, to see if he could truly live the life he now wanted. That meant making decisions that would not only affect him, but everyone around him. His first decision came sooner than he expected. He had always relied on his network, his associates, to maintain his grip on power. But now, after everything he had learned, he knew that he couldn't continue living with the same mentality of fear and manipulation. He needed to confront those closest to him, those who had worked for him, with the same honesty and respect he had given to the Maid. He needed to show them that his leadership was no longer based on intimidation, but on trust and fairness. And so, he called a meeting. The room was filled with his closest associates, the men and women who had helped build his empire, who had followed his commands without question for years. They all sat in silence, waiting for him to speak. But this time, the Mafia boss felt different. He wasn't the same man they had known, the man who ruled with an iron fist. This was a man who had learned something valuable. He stood at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but firm. "I've called you here today because I need to make something clear," he began, his voice steady, but his tone was softer than usual. "For years, we've operated under the same rules of power, fear, and control. I've led you by making sure everyone knew their place. But now I see that there's more to leadership than that. There's more to life than that." The room was silent, the men and women around him exchanging glances. The boss could sense their confusion, but he pressed on. "You've all been loyal to me, and I respect that loyalty. But loyalty isn't just about obedience. It's about trust. It's about being honest with each other and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. And from now on, that's how things will be." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss felt vulnerable, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for blind loyalty anymore," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm asking for respect. I'm asking for honesty. We're all in this together. And that means no more fear, no more manipulation. We're going to build something that's stronger than what we've had before. Something real." The silence that followed was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The men and women around him were processing his words, trying to understand this new version of the man who had led them for so long. And for the first time, the Mafia boss felt like they were truly hearing him, truly seeing him. One by one, his associates began to nod. Some of them exchanged quiet words, but none of them spoke out of turn. The shift in the room was palpable. The boss had no illusions about the road ahead. He knew that change wouldn't come easily, and there would be resistance, especially from those who had grown accustomed to the old ways. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that resistance. He was ready to face it. The changes had started with the Maid, but they would ripple through every part of his life, his empire, his family. As he looked around the room at the faces of those who had helped him build his world, he knew that this was the beginning of something new. It was a chance to build not just an empire, but a legacy based on something more powerful than fear. And as the meeting ended, the Mafia boss walked out of the room with a sense of purpose he had never known before. He was no longer the man who had relied on control. He was a man who believed in something greater: trust, respect, and the power of genuine connection. I hope you are ready for the next part of the journey. The shift in the Mafia boss's mindset continued to reverberate through his life, but the road ahead was far from smooth. His associates, though initially shocked by his words, were beginning to adjust to the changes. Some were hesitant, others skeptical, but there was a growing sense that something profound was happening. The Mafia boss could feel the tension as he moved through his day-to-day responsibilities. There was a quiet expectation in the air, a weight that he hadn't noticed before. His decisions were no longer just about maintaining power. They were about building something new, something sustainable, and it wasn't always easy. He spent more time with his son, bonding with him in a way that he never had before. For the first time, he was learning to be present, to offer love without the looming shadow of fear. His son was thriving, his laughter filling the house more than it ever had, and the bond between them was growing stronger each day. But it was the Maid who had made all of this possible. Her kindness had broken through the walls he had spent a lifetime building. She had given him the courage to change, to see that there was more to life than the pursuit of power. He had offered her respect, and she had returned it by showing him what it meant to truly care for someone. Her presence in his life had become something more than just a source of comfort for his son. She had become his anchor, the one person who had shown him the value of human connection. And yet, despite the changes in his life, the Mafia boss was still grappling with a question that lingered in the back of his mind. Was this transformation real, or was it just a temporary shift? He didn't know how to reconcile the man he had been with the man he was becoming. Was it possible to shed the weight of a lifetime of ruthless ambition, or would it always be a part of him? The answer seemed elusive. One evening, as the house settled into quiet, the boss found himself sitting alone in his study, staring out at the darkened skyline. His thoughts were heavy, a mixture of hope and doubt. It was then that the door opened quietly, and the maid entered, her footsteps soft on the polished floor. She had always been there, quietly watching over everything, taking care of the things that no one else seemed to notice. She had a way of moving through the house without drawing attention to herself, yet her presence was felt in every corner. "Sir," she said gently, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to face her, surprised by her sudden appearance, but there was no hint of discomfort in her expression. She was calm, collected as always. "You don't need to call me sir," he replied with a small smile. "You've earned the right to call me by my name." She nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I wanted to speak with you about something," she said. "Of course," he replied, motioning for her to sit. He watched her as she took a seat across from him, her posture relaxed but attentive. There was something different about her, a quiet confidence that he hadn't noticed before. She had always been composed, but now there was an added depth to her presence. "I've been thinking about the changes you've made," she began, her voice steady. "About the way things are now, and how they've changed between us." He leaned forward, intrigued by her words. "Go on," he said, his voice encouraging. "I've seen how hard you've tried to make things right," she continued. "You've opened yourself up in ways I never thought possible. But I also know that change is never easy. It's not always something that happens overnight. And I want you to know that I see the effort you're making." The Mafia boss listened intently, his gaze fixed on her. Her words were thoughtful, measured, and kind. She wasn't just acknowledging the changes in him. She was acknowledging the difficulty of those changes. She knew better than anyone that the past couldn't be erased with a single decision. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "But you're right. Change is hard. And I'm still figuring it out." She nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "It's not about being perfect," she said. "It's about trying. About making the decision to do better, even when it's hard. And you've already made that decision." He looked at her, a sense of peace settling over him. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent my whole life thinking that power was the answer to everything. But now, I'm beginning to see that it's not about power at all. It's about connection, about loyalty and love." The maid smiled, her eyes reflecting the depth of her belief. "That's the most important thing," she said. "And I know you're capable of it. You've already shown me that." The Mafia boss felt something stir inside him, a quiet warmth that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was the kind of warmth that came from knowing that you were on the right path, even if that path was uncertain. He had come a long way from the man he had been, and there was still more to learn, more to change. But for the first time, he felt confident that he was heading in the right direction. "Thank you," he said again, his voice low. "For everything. You've shown me that it's not about the empire I've built or the money I've made. It's about the people who matter. And you matter to me." The maid's smile deepened, and in that moment, she knew that this was only the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter for both of them. A chapter where love, respect, and kindness took precedence over everything else. And together, they would build something new, a legacy that would last far beyond the walls of the mansion. I hope you are ready for the final chapter of this journey. As the days passed, the Mafia boss found himself settling into a new routine, a new mindset. The mansion, once filled with the cold echoes of power and control, now felt like a home, alive with laughter, warmth, and the sound of his son's joy. His relationship with the maid had transformed as well, from one of simple employer and servant to something deeper, more meaningful. She was no longer just someone who worked for him. She had become a trusted confidant, a symbol of the kind of humanity he had been missing all these years. Every day, the boss felt the weight of his past slowly lift. He had spent his life in a world built on fear, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. But now, he was learning a different kind of strength, the kind that came from kindness, from vulnerability, and from the willingness to show up for the people you cared about. It was something he never thought he'd experience, but it had become his reality. The maid had shown him the power of love, of loyalty, and of compassion. He had promised to offer her a role that was meaningful, to treat her with the respect she deserved. And as the days went on, he found himself keeping that promise in ways that surprised even him. He involved her more in the decisions that shaped the household, asking her opinion, listening to her thoughts. He knew he couldn't change everything overnight, but with her by his side, he felt more capable than ever of making the right choices. His son, too, was flourishing. The bond between them had grown stronger, and the Mafia boss found himself learning from his son just as much as his son learned from him. It was a slow process, but each day brought them closer. The once distant figure of the powerful boss was now replaced by someone who cared deeply about the people in his life. But as with all great transformations, there were challenges. His associates, those who had once feared him and followed his commands without question, began to notice the change. Some were skeptical, unsure of the direction he was taking, while others were cautiously supportive. The Mafia boss knew that his leadership would be tested, that not everyone would welcome the shift in power dynamics. But he was determined to stay the course. He had seen the difference kindness made, and he wasn't going to abandon it now. One evening, as the sun began to set and the house was quiet, the Mafia boss sat in his study, reflecting on everything that had changed. He was no longer the man who commanded loyalty through fear. He had built a new life, one based on mutual respect and trust. But there was still one thing he needed to do, one final step to solidify the change he had made. He knew that his empire, his legacy, was built on more than just power. It was built on the people who stood by him, on the loyalty he had earned, and on the love he had found in the most unexpected of places. And it was time to make that known. He called a meeting with his closest associates. They filed into the room one by one, their faces serious as they took their seats around the large table. The Mafia boss stood at the head of the table, looking each of them in the eye. "I know that things have changed around here," he began, his voice steady. "And I know that some of you may not understand why." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "But I want you to know that the change is real. I'm not the man I used to be, and I don't plan on going back to that." The room was silent. The boss could feel their eyes on him, waiting for him to continue. "We've built an empire, yes. But it's time to build something more. Something that lasts, something that means something. And that starts with treating each other with the respect we all deserve. No more fear. No more manipulation." He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of each associate. "This isn't just about power anymore. It's about loyalty. True loyalty. Loyalty that comes from respect, not fear." The room was still. Then, slowly, one of his oldest associates spoke. "You've changed, boss," he said, his voice gruff. "But we're with you. We've always been with you." The others nodded, one by one, until the entire room was in agreement. It was a moment that felt like a turning point, not just for the boss, but for everyone in the room. They were no longer just part of an empire built on fear. They were part of something different, something that could last, something that could be passed down. The Mafia boss stood taller than he ever had before. He wasn't just the head of a crime family anymore. He was a leader, not just of an empire, but of something that transcended power. He was a man who had learned the importance of love, of loyalty, and of kindness. And with those lessons, he knew he could build a legacy that would stand the test of time. As the meeting ended, the Mafia boss walked out of the room, a sense of calm settling over him. He had made his decision. He had shown his associates that there was another way to lead, another way to live. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly free. The mansion was quiet that night, but there was a sense of peace in the air. His son was upstairs, sleeping soundly, and the maid was in the next room, where she had become more than just someone who served him. She had become an equal. The Mafia boss smiled to himself, knowing that he had finally found what he had been searching for all these years. The journey wasn't over, but it was a new beginning. And for the first time, he felt at peace with the choices he had made. Discover a gripping tale of transformation in this heartfelt story about a powerful man learning the true meaning of kindness and loyalty. As a Mafia boss slowly unravels the importance of compassion his world shifts in ways he never expected. From a relationship with his son to a bond with a woman who shows him vulnerability, this story delves into themes of personal growth, forgiveness, and love. This journey is not just about redemption, but about discovering what it truly means to care for others. With romance stories that highlight deep emotional connections, this narrative explores the delicate balance between power and compassion. Watch as the Mafia boss's heart begins to soften, finding love and respect in places he never thought to look. As romance stories go, this one is filled with twists that keep you on the edge of your seat. You'll witness a man who thought he was invincible learning that sometimes real strength comes from opening up to others and embracing vulnerability. This is a journey of change, one where love teaches a hard man to truly live. Whether you are drawn to heartwarming romance stories or complex characters facing their deepest fears, this story is sure to captivate you. As the story progresses, the Mafia boss's life will never be the same, and neither will his views on loyalty, love, and family. In the end, romance stories like this remind us that change is possible when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and open to the unexpected.